Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this presentation on championing an open source revolution in a highly regulated industry. My name is Caroline Phares, and I am the head of life sciences at Domino Data Lab. And with me today, I have an excellent panel. Dan Schremek.
Hello.
From GSK, he's a therapy head, clinical programming therapy head at GSK. Thomas Neitmann from Denali. And Ellis Hughes from GSK, data science leader. And Thomas, you are a
Associate
Director of data science at Denali. So the reason that we're having this conversation today is because within the pharmaceutical industry, specifically in clinical trials reporting, there has been a growing movement to include open source languages in addition to SAS, which has been the predominant language used for statistical analysis and reporting of clinical trials. And we're going to investigate why that is and what's coming up in the future and what the challenges are and how we're going to overcome them. So my first question, actually, Ellis, can you tell us a little bit about the history of this R movement?
The history of the R movement?
Yeah.
Well, I think R has been around for a number of years now. It was started in '92, and it's been slowly gaining a lot of acceptance across the variety of industries. R, being open source, a lot of people are able to use that. Coming in from university, people have been taught how to use these tools through the schooling, through classes and whatnot, and now they're kind of bringing that into their work lives after they've graduated and trying to use those tools as well. And so it's got a lot of opportunities with that. That's where a lot of these new statistical tools and programs are being developed. And so as organizations are trying to use these new statistical abilities, they're really should be adopting these open source tools because that's where it's being developed first. And so I think that's kind of where the groundswell is coming from. And then as more of the basic research is working its way into the clinical trials, we're trying to use R more in that sort of situation.
And is it really true that SAS has always been the only language that the FDA would accept for clinical submissions? What's the deal with that?
So the FDA does not require any specific languages for an acceptance. So I have a little story. When I first started working, I was working at a CRO. And the first week I was there, I was learning R. We were doing statistical genetics. That's where a lot of the tools, again, are built in R. The CEO came by to me. He's like, Ellis, this R thing, it's really not going to go anywhere. There's no use for this. If you really want to go forward in this industry, you have to use SAS because SAS is the only language accepted by the FDA. I later found out that was not true. In fact, in 2015, the FDA gave a statement saying, we do not prefer any language. In fact, all you need to do is follow the ICH E6 and E9, which states that you're responsible for proving the language that you're using is safe and reliable, and you're responsible for the data quality that you provide to us, and you are validating your environment and the software you use. There is no requirement on any language you actually have to use. But I think SAS has been around for a long time, and there is a comfort with that, as well as being one of the first movers in the space. And so there's a comfort around it, and so it's formed this myth that SAS is the only language that you can use. SAS is the only language accepted by the FDA, and that's just not true.
So what does that mean for, you're a leader of an organization that does this clinical analysis and reporting.
Right.
What does it mean for you? What does it mean for your people?
It means that this myth is pervasive throughout our company, and that's a challenge. And I think everybody is going to have that challenge. But what we have to ask ourselves here is, what is our industry looking like in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years? And as Ellis has said, there has been this growing use of R in the industry, right? So how do we want to position ourselves in an organization to be able to take advantage of that? We do see a business benefit to be able to diversify what languages we want to use at GSK, because we don't know what's going to happen. It could be all R, it could be all SAS, it could be all Python. We have no idea. But do we want to put all of our eggs in one basket? So I can talk a little bit about how we have sort of built that critical mass. Because when you think about it, one of the biggest challenges, how do I go from an organization that has 98, 99%, well, 100% SAS programmers? Some of them know R, okay? Some of them know R, but how do we build that critical mass of R programmers where we can make it work? Because imagine a simple case where you're building an R program, right, for a clinical trial, and you get sick or you go on vacation. Who's going to cover for you, right? In most organizations with SAS, you have tons of people that can. So how are we going to grow our skill set, upskill in R over time? That's something that we've been doing, and I can talk about that. And the other thing is, how can we convince senior leaders that those myths are just myths, and that we are able to submit in these other, or use these programming languages to create the analysis, and it would be acceptable. So the first thing, you need bold leadership, right? Like I said before, you have to have that vision, and you have to create a plan to follow on that vision. So what we did at GSK was take a step-by-step approach to building that capability. And the first thing we did, senior management said, okay, this year every single programmer is going to be trained in R. It's just a basic R training to get them up and running, get the access, so they can start developing those skills. If there's any downtime in their work, they can start building that up. Along with that, management was like, you know what, we would like every programmer to QC outputs using R. Now, these outputs were tables, listings, and figures that are used in clinical study reports. The production is done in SAS, so there's really no risk there, but the outputs are QC'd in R, and that starts to get the flavor of the experience going. And then after that, we talked to our project, so a year after that, we talked to our project and study leaders and said, okay, now we want 25% of all outputs to be QC'd using R. So you can see we're starting to build momentum here. And at the same time, we also took a bold move to say, okay, we're going to produce all the production in R, but we're going to QC it in SAS. And we're going to use our validated SAS environments to run this R program. So we figured out a way to do that, and we felt that risk is very low. So as you can see, over time, we're starting to build that R capability, and we're taking a break at each endpoint to evaluate, is it working? Are we mitigating the risks? What are we learning along the way? And after a while, now we have a critical mass. We're not there yet, but in just a couple years, we have many, many trained R programmers at GSK that can help in the future. And I think that allows us now to bring in R trained people right from the start, because we have that infrastructure in place, right? So we don't have to train them up in SAS at all. We have the infrastructure in place to just use their R skills.
Right, and that brings two thoughts to my mind. Number one, the new talent that's coming out of universities, are they familiar with SAS, as familiar with R? And the other question I have, I know that the reason that there's an advantage to using open source is that in these pre-competitive spaces that we work in, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, which is a highly collaborative industry in the pre-competitive space, there's so much collaboration that can happen in developing standardized ways to and using R of doing analysis and reporting, of creating standard data set structures, et cetera. Thomas, you are both young. I don't know if I was allowed to say that. But, okay, let me say, your career is growing. Your career is emerging. And you are also have been highly involved in the open source community, in the Pharmaverse community, which is one of these communities. So you've been building your career in this way, and you've done very well. And you, prior to joining Denali, I know you were at Roche, who is one of the leaders in the pharmaceutical industry and moving in this direction. What can you tell us about the workforce, your experience in getting into this, how you actually got into this area of clinical reporting and using R, and your experience with Pharmaverse?
Right. So I still remember when I made the decision I want to join this industry, working on clinical trials, and I had a background in R for probably 6 years at that time. I felt very proficient. And then I learned that, SAS is the thing, so I was like, well, I can learn that for sure. Did a course, got my certificates, got my first job at a CRO. Didn't quite like it so much there. The tech stack, as well as the company itself, had the opportunity to join Roche, and started off, using that existing tech stack for like half a year on that first trial I worked on. But then I saw that in the organization there was this really big push to move away from that and towards open source, and in particular R, especially kind of data visualization applications like Shiny, etc. And basically I stopped after the initial 6 months to ever write a SAS program again. So for the past, 4 or 5 years, I've never done that again, which I think is quite a fortunate position. Many people don't get that. But going back to when I interviewed there, I think they would have never hired me if I didn't have SAS knowledge back then. Whereas right before I left, I was heavily involved in recruiting in Basel, in Switzerland, where I'm based. And we had hardly anyone who even knew SAS. If we got fresh graduates from college, throughout Europe, I think no college teaches really SAS. That's just not a thing. So that was certainly one of the points why the organization thought it would be a smart move to move in that direction. But I think a much bigger thing than that is that I think everyone here would agree that if you look at data science at large 5, 10, 15 years back, it was a totally different space. We talk about large language models now all the time, ChatGPT. That's all thing, even 2, 3 years ago that didn't really exist. And if you look at tools like Python, Python used to be a general purpose language for, all the stuff you would need to do. But then at some point people were like, well, we can repurpose this for data science. Scikit-learn and all these tools came up. But then again, you look at this industry and what people used 10 years ago, 20 years ago, probably the same thing they still use now for the most part. So really, it begs the question, what is hindering us from being innovative and adopting new tools? And I think a big part of that is that SAS is kind of a closed source ecosystem. You buy it from that vendor, you're kind of locked in that. Every organization, even though we all face the same problems, develops a tool stack on top of that is never shared outside the organizations. And with open source, it's all about collaboration and saying that we all face this issue, let's work together, let's build something that we all benefit from. And I think people are very cognizant that at the end of the day, what comes out of that is better than anything they could build on their own in-house. So I think that's really powerful to acknowledge, and Pharmaverse sort of grew out of that awareness. And I think initially it was GSK, Johnson & Johnson, and Atorus Research kind of coming together and saying, we all face these similar issues. We're all moving to R, so let's not repeat the quote-unquote mistake of the past and build tools in-house on top of an open source language. Let's join forces. Then later on, Roche joined that. I think most recently Novo Nordisk out of Denmark came on board. And there's now really a plethora of libraries which you can readily adopt to do kind of clinical trial data processing, reporting, analysis. And I joined now a kind of small biotech company, and obviously the question came up, kind of how are we positioning ourselves? Do we go with the old way of using SAS, or do we embrace this kind of new way of working? And obviously I was pushing very hard for the latter, and I think people really saw the value because unlike a large organization where you have this tool stack already in there, there's sort of resistance to change. That was not the case there. It was basically, I could show there is this package which has been developed by GSK and Roche, there's another one here coming out of that large organization, and people were just like, yeah, well, that's awesome, let's just readily adopt that. And I think, I would definitely hope, and I think that this will be the case in more smaller organizations going forward, but without kind of the big names like Roche and GSK, I think this would have never happened in the first place. So thank you very much.
So it took some bold moves. And so now, what are the challenges? What is keeping things from accelerating more quickly?
So I can take a piece of that. I think it's a shift in mindset. Really, that's what's going on here. I mean, yeah, we're talking about changing tools or talking about changing programming languages, but behind all of that is a change in how we want to approach things. I think, Thomas, you presented at Hughes earlier this year, and you said we compete on compounds, not on code. And embracing that idea of when we can share things together, we're able to move faster. We're all already using a lot of the same standards, so why would we develop code differently when we can pull that all together? So some of the blockers in that are getting people to accept that mindset of we want to change how we've worked before. And some people have built their careers around this knowledge that they have. And they not necessarily are against this new thought process, but they're used to their way of thinking.
I think there's a couple arguments that people still throw out there as challenges. And one of those is, okay, if I use this proprietary software, I pay for the support, right? So I can just call them up and say, I'm having trouble. And they feel much more comfortable with that scenario. But I think things like Pharmaverse and the growing community, that essentially becomes that support system that you can just go ask other experts for, and then they can give you that information back. And I think it's free. Yeah, it's free. And then I think the lack of documentation is another thing. So I think one of the keys for Pharmaverse folks that are to ensure that documentation is in place. And another thing is open source is perceived to be less tested, I would say, compared to like a proprietary software. But I can tell you at GSK, we develop SAS macros. We have to test them. We can't just assume they're going. We can program some code and it's going to be accurate and work. We still have to put that time and testing strategy in place over time. And I think that's what the R community can do, is actually more robust testing in different situations, so that many more people are doing the testing in many more environments. And I think it allows it to be even more accepted and accurate, I would say, using the open source.
So, yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think we really have built a lot of momentum, and everyone sort of sees it's there right now, and people are getting excited about it. But I think the one thing that people are still sort of, that last thing is that I think there has not been a submission to the FDA yet where a company said we've basically done everything with an open source tool and it got accepted. I think that's kind of the last doubt, and that's out there, even though there is obviously this clarification statement that the FDA says, we don't care what you lose as long as it's reliable. There have been also test submissions in collaboration with the FDA. So industry coming together saying we want to use R, we want to partner with you. We did a test submission, everything worked out fine. But just the fact that no one just yet got a drug approved with a submission in R is kind of that last thing. And I think if that sort of, domino falls, then really everyone will kind of realize that, yeah, it actually works. And I think that will be kind of the last hurdle we have to overcome. And I know that back when I was at Roche, we did that transition towards moving away from our old computing environment towards something that is built in-house, which looks strikingly similar to Domino, actually. So I think you're doing a good job. And the idea was we'll use open source going forward for all our trials. And in fact, there was one trial in oncology which is supposed to be read out by the end of this year. And suffice that, given that this will read out positively, that would be basically a submission being done completely in R. And that could be that last hurdle we have to overcome. So. Now I'm kind of on the outside looking at that, quite excited, and hope that that turns out to be. Because I think after that, no one will be able to raise any doubts anymore. It's just been proven to work.
Yes, absolutely. I have a sort of difficult question. Uh-oh. I mean, I don't know if it's difficult, but this was several years ago. I actually was sitting down with Michael Rimler, who was also very instrumental in the Pharmaverse. And we were discussing this whole thing with R and SAS, and we were actually discussing doing QC, what you were just talking about, Dan, doing QC in R as a means of starting to build that R capability within GSK. And he mentioned something about this was I can't remember what function or what calculation that, several decimal points out, there was a discrepancy between R and SAS, and in estimating. Yeah. What was that all about, and why is that important? Or is it important?
Well, I think a lot of times when we do QC, we're looking at a proc compare. I know we should be looking at more than that, and we train our programmers to do that. But when you see something that says, okay, there's a difference there, you have to look into the difference, and it kind of causes issues. But I wouldn't say this is necessarily an R versus SAS thing, because sometimes when we up version SAS, we get those same things. They may change some assumptions or default attributes to a model, and that causes things to change, and that has caused us issues with QC in the past. And it's also different operating systems as well as the way they. I'm not a tech genius, but somehow the way the information is stored is different to that level, and that when you may do it on PC SAS versus Unix SAS, that comes out as different, right? So I think that should be recognized as anticipated, that we will come across those challenges, and it's not a big issue, I don't think.
So, because you're going to have to choose, is it your QC output or your production output that's actually the standard? How do you know which one is correct?
Well, I think if your results and your interpretation of a trial are dependent on the accuracy to that length, I think you do have to consider it more, but I would highly doubt probably. Well, yeah, so sometimes when you get on the fringes, like, is this a responder or not? When you get out to that decimal place, it could be the difference. So that is a challenge that we'll have to address when we come across that. I'm not saying that one is better than the other at this point, but we'll have to look into that a little bit more detail on a case-by-case basis.
I wonder if you could bring in Python and see then what Python comes up.
Another
Yeah,
reference.
see which one it validates, or if it adds a third level of complexity.
And there's some efforts also in the open source to try to pull together, here's all the different models that are in SAS or in R or in Python, and demonstrate not only here's what the differences are, but here's how you can try to approximate the same results. Because the defaults are different. They're different languages, they're written by different people, they have different assumptions in mind and intended uses. So the defaults, while they're still smart defaults, they are different because of the intended purpose, intended use. But I think it's called CAMUS. I forget what the acronym stands for, but there's a working group that is trying to go through and identify all the different modeling tools that exist in the different languages, and go, okay, here's how you can try to replicate the same results in R, in SAS, in Python, and try to reduce some of that anxiety, to explain away, oh, well, the value is 0.000001 different. Is that okay? Does that mean something?
Yeah.
And help people not have to get so scared about that sort of difference.
So we talked a little bit about how, coming out of university and training, the workforce is basically very proficient in R, probably proficient in Python now, very proficient in Python. And you might have to train them in SAS if you're to start doing clinical programming. But I'm curious to know why that is. Why do you think that is, that SAS is not being taught in universities? Or is there a reason why SAS is no longer, for this emerging generation, it's no longer preferred, I guess. Yeah.
I want to bring in cost, because I think for universities, they're so are pharmaceutical companies, but cost is a big thing. And when you can do sort of similar things using an open source that doesn't cost as much as a subscription, I think that has led to the fact that a lot of universities and schools will use R when teaching their statisticians or whatever, data scientists, right? They'll make R more available than SAS, and I think that's why we see folks coming just out of university having that R-based skill set as opposed to the SAS-based skill set. And I think what you're going to find is over time, there's going to be an inflection point where it's going to actually cost probably more to train somebody and using SAS and get them up to speed versus having, if you have the architecture infrastructure in place, to be able to bring in somebody R and just put them right to use.
So interesting. Something that I found out last year when I was reading a little bit about history of statistical computing and stuff. You guys remember S+, right?
Yeah.
And that actually started as an open source language called S, and then it was commercialized as S+. And actually, when it was commercialized, is when it kind of stopped. You know, the usage just went down, and that actually spawned the emergence of R. And so R is sort of it's a reaction or a response to, you know, hey, we want to be able to do this without having to pay for subscription. And also, it's a very quickly progressing language because it's open source.
Yes.
And so do you see any advantages to R than SAS, and what are they?
Well, I think a lot of new techniques are being built in R and open source in general too. I don't think we necessarily need to speak just about R in the way that things are just progressing so incredibly quickly. When we talked about AI and the large language models that are now being developed in the open source and not in any specific companies, that people are sharing out this knowledge and this information. And so by embracing this open source mindset and tools, we can pull those in much sooner than any proprietary software can ever evolve, because there are many, many more people working in the open source than any one company can ever realistically have. And there is a community of verifying and checking that the results are correct, and if you get a lot of people using it and they're seeing, hey, this value is incorrect, they can give feedback, and because it's open code, they can provide updates to that same code base to fix those issues and merge it in. And then other people try it out, and they're like, okay, that solved that problem, but not this problem. Okay, here's another fix. And they can build it over time to be more accurate, be more responsive. And with those things combined, if we're bringing in that open source, we get that benefit. We get the benefit of thousands of people having worked on this, having thousands of people having used it, and pull that experience in for our use cases. And hopefully we get back to that as well.
I think really open source empowers users, programmers, data scientists to take sort of ownership of the tools they're using. If there's something where you find a bug, you flag it on GitHub, you might fix it yourself because it's something that's keeping you back right now. Whereas if you use something proprietary, well, I guess you can flag the bug, but then you wait until someone at that company says that, yeah, in our backlog, we'll prioritize that now. And if you want any new method available, it's not like you can just implement it yourself. I mean, yes, you can write SAS macros, but really you cannot write your own procs, which are kind of the crux of SAS, the language itself, whereas everyone can write an R package, a Python library, or whatever. And I mean, look at the number of packages which are out there. I think R is right now at something like 10,000 packages, and it used to be less than 3,000, I think maybe 6 years ago or something like that.
They're like 19,000.
Well, see, not even up to date. And I think Python is probably another 0 more at this point in time. So, empower the users and then take ownership of that. And it's just, to me personally, I remember when I was still in university, and I came from an R background, and then I started working at a research institute, and they use something called MATLAB, which is also a proprietary language. And then I wanted to take some work home and install it on my machine, and suddenly I was like, well, you don't have a license for that. And I was like, what is a license for a programming language? And it felt very foreign. And that's just, I think, not a place many people would like to be at this point. This kind of openness out there, that's really something people expect of a tool they use, and especially if you think of something like reproducibility, open science, how do you get that into in sync with something you pay for, where you have to rely on a particular vendor?
I want to take an approach that as a manager at GSK, but also somebody looking for, you're a programmer looking for a job. So as Caroline knows, we have this current system that's called HARP. That's our statistical computing environment that we're moving away from. But that's been around for 20 years, and it was like revolutionary in its time, like a long time ago. And it's great. But there have been times when people have said, I don't want to go to GSK because I don't want to be limited to that. It was essentially like that proprietary SCE. And then working with vendors, you know, we some of our vendors can use our HARP, right? But the people that work at those CROs don't necessarily want to be ring-fenced. They have to be ring-fenced to know HARP, right? And I think moving out of that, moving into open source, now it's easier for us to recruit. People want to come to GSK because they can build those skills using GitHub, using open source. And we don't want them to take that to other places, but at the same time, we can then bring that talent in as well that's already experienced. And then with the vendors and the CROs, we'll also have that better pool, I think, of programmers that can help us when we outsource our studies as well. If we want, we'll be able to bring the programs in-house quite easier if we need to do something fast to respond to a regulatory request or something like that, where we wouldn't have been able to before.
So there are challenges that we've talked about, you know, documentation, people being a little bit hesitant. They say, oh, well, it's not validated. This is one I hear all the time. Ours not validated, you know. And I remember also being at GSK looking at how are we going to validate R? But it's not really about validating R, right? It's just making sure that the packages are using or doing what they intend, what you intend for them to do for you. And what is so daunting about that? Is there anything daunting about that?
I don't think it is as scary as everyone makes it out to be. It's like this big boogeyman. And everyone's like, oh, but you got to do validation. But all validation is an effort in documentation. You're trying to prove to yourself and then any regulators, any folks that you talk to about why you trust this. Why should you trust this language? I mean, the converse can be said about anything any code we write, any language we use. Why should we trust this? And so there's history in some other languages that people have used. In R, it's been around for a while, so there's a fair amount of trust. A lot of people use that. But if you want to go through the effort of documentation for the base language, the folks that wrote that had lots of experience in development and have PhDs in statistics. For packages, you can look at number of people using the package as well as the authors themselves. But because it's open source, you can also take a look at the code itself. You look at how did they write that code? Did they document it well? Did they provide examples on how this code's supposed to be used? Did they write tests proving that the code works as they expect it to? And you can inspect all of that yourself. You don't have to take their word for it going, oh, no, trust us. We tested that for you. You can look for it yourself. And if you don't think those tests are sufficient, you can add your own. You can open a pull request to that package and go, hey, I saw that you weren't testing this aspect or this edge case that I came across. Let's add that in. And so there's a variety of different ways that you can approach validation. It's really up to your organization to decide the specific process that you do. And I think that's also why people get scared, because they're not prescribed what you're supposed to be doing, how exactly you need to do validation. They go, well, then I can't do it. But if you read the guidances that are given out, they do give you ideas of what you can follow. There's a lot of effort being done in the open right now, discussing what are approaches that people can take. I just named a few popular ways that people are approaching validation of R packages. There's the R Validation Hub, which is a white paper explaining basically what I just talked about, R core and the base language, and then additional languages, and then internal packages that you write. There's the Transcelerate MOA that also discusses this approach. So there's a plethora of information available for folks if they want to find it, but they have to want to find it.
I think there's a couple of points to consider, and maybe my experts here can speak about it better than me, but because of open source, you have packages being updated all the time, right? So how do you control for that fact? And how you may have to have an environment where you lock that down. I think that's one of the only challenges I would say, right, is being able to lock down that aspect, which might be easier with SAS.
I think you do have to take a bit of freedom from the data scientist away of not being able to just install any random package out there and create an environment where you're not actually sure anymore that it actually does what it's supposed to do. So you have to make that effort of saying that this is the set of packages we want to use for the outcomes we want to provide in the end. Go through that process of validation and then to some extent freeze, quote unquote, that environment, But then, I mean, you don't use that then forever. Maybe every 6 months, every year, you update that to newer versions. And then you go through the same process, make sure everything still works. So you keep up with the evolution that is going on there, maybe just not as fast as if, you know, it's just me on my MacBook at home installing the latest package that came out yesterday. But I think that is a great compromise for us. We still get the innovative things that get published very fast, maybe not just as fast as if we were outside of this industry.
But kind of do that, how often does proprietary software update? It's interesting hearing folks that are used to a world where it doesn't change very often. All of a sudden you provide a world where it does change literally every day. And all of a sudden they're like, well, can I get the latest thing? Can I get the latest thing? It's like, well...
And I think what people are afraid of, especially if they come from SaaS, is I think if you write a program in SaaS right now and then you put it on a SaaS version from probably 20 years ago, it still works because they were very hesitant to like breaking changes, whereas in open source, people do that all the time because they want to make things better. And sometimes that means you start with an idea, you test it out, and then you see, well, it's maybe not the best idea to do it like this. Let's do it like this instead. So there's this popular package called ggplot2 for data visualization in R. And I mean, the 2 is for a reason. They used to be just a ggplot, and it became somewhat popular. But then the author was like, you know what, we could do this better. So let's put this new one out there, ggplot2. And so you just have to shift your mindset a bit and acknowledge that this definitely can be a pain point sometimes, but actually you gain so much from that innovation that is there that I think net at the end of the day, this is really good for you.
Well said.
I have to say that this is, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Domino here. Not only because I work for Domino, but also that I used to work for GSK. And I'm very, very familiar with HARP. And I'm very familiar with the Domino SE that you've now adopted and migrating to.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons it gives you such an advantage is, you know, open source does change quite often, and you want to be able to validate those packages on an as-need basis, and you also want to be able to run your study or, you know, an old study on the old version at the time and be able to reproduce results because you could get asked at any time, and you want to be able to do that easily. And you want to be able to enable your data scientists to do more exploratory work and use the packages that they need without hindering the work, the clinical study work that's happening. And I mean, having a statistical computing environment like that opens so many doors and opens so many possibilities and allows you to move that much more quickly. So, okay, I've said it. I actually had not planned to say that, seriously. But this conversation gets me really excited, and I had to say it. So now that these capabilities exist and you have this freedom, these doors are open, you know, what's next? You know, just say we get through this year, and Thomas, just like you said, you know, Roche does their first submission. You've got, you know, Novo Nordisk does their first submission in R, and all of a sudden the floodgates are open. You know, how fast do you think it's going to move?
So fast.
I think it's going to cause a lot of companies that are sort of looking from the outside to be like, I want to wait to see that it works. They're going to start coming in.
Yes.
I think, and they can sort of take advantage of everything that's been put in place by the pioneers. But if anybody is out there, the leaders that are thinking about that, you want to get in now because you still have the opportunity to shape the future. The longer you stand on the sidelines and the further away you get, the less chance you have to influence what actually goes on in the industry. So I think I think you're going to see a lot more participation once that happens. But I would say if you are thinking about getting in, do it earlier than later. Yeah.
Don't want to be left behind.
Yeah.
I mean, but I definitely know a head of programming at a very, very large pharma he's always in the talks, but his organization so far is kind of, you know, we'll see what's going on there. We are at the pulse of the time. And I think, you know, as you said, kind of the floodgates will open at that time, and they will definitely jump on that. And I think organizations which so far really have ignored this, at some point they will be like, oh, what happened there? And we're sort of left behind now. And I think this point you mentioned of if you adopt it now, you still get to influence a lot and shape things, because
Right.
it's all about collaboration, right? The open source. And if you are an early adopter, you have a lot to say. Whereas if you're like at the late majority of the curve, well, then many things are already in place. And definitely you can change things and still influence, but definitely not to that extent that you could if you're on the early side of things. So in that sense, I would very much encourage people to not wait too long in that sense.
I would too. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to open it up to questions from the audience if anybody has one. Okay.
Okay, sorry.
So you've built a community of interest with, what was it called,
Pharmaverse.
You built the Pharmaverse, so you have a community of interest where they're able to handle your industry-specific
Yes.
Correct.
issues with R, or just for open source in general?
Pharma versus R,
So
right?
Pharmaverse is focused on R, but I think there are efforts to try to make it more broad. I mean, there was the R Pharma conference that's been held for the last several years, and they recently formed a nonprofit, and they changed their name from R in Pharma to Open Source in Pharma to represent the fact that they aren't necessarily pushing a single language. They're pushing a mindset. I keep on saying mindset, but an idea of we can use open source in pharma, and they want to help promote that as much as they can.
It was a two-part question, sorry for that. So you've done that, so that handles a lot of the external. With the internals, you guys have also done a lot of changes internally with how you handle your personnel, succession, what have you. All this costs money. It also provides capability value. Has this been and will it be viewed as a value add because of the increase in capabilities for future? Because we're talking about R primarily now, but whatever comes out next, you now have an inbuilt, or at least right this minute, have an inbuilt capability to be able to influence the positive outcome of any desired change. How do you intend to keep that?
Since again, I guess it's mindset. You were talking about mindset, right? And I guess that there's actually some people in the audience here who I think we spoke a little bit about this at a panel yesterday about the mindset of change. All right, to be agile, have a workforce that's actually agile, that's actually curious about, exploring new capabilities and not afraid to fail small and fail fast in order to progress more quickly. And yeah, I don't know.
I think that the biggest step right now is to move from the closed source world to the open source world. Once we make that step, in theory, we're laying the groundwork, and we're trying to be conscientious of that as we're working on it to make sure that we're not, again, pick up one language, put it in another. I think that would be probably not the right move to do, but try to build out the new systems such that we can adopt the next language, the next tool, the next thing, and have it not be so daunting to be, oh, we've already done that. We already know how to do that. Takes time, but we know how to do it. It's no longer figuring out how, it's just a matter of doing.
And to be fair, what I talked about in the beginning does require a resource, does require cost to train everybody up, and it does take initially longer. There's a learning curve. So we are in investment phase, but that's why we're looking at 1, 3, 5 years from now. What's a clinical program or role going to be? I think we're setting ourselves up for a good return on investment when that happens, and who knows what happens with generative AI, how that's going to impact this. We didn't even get into that.
We didn't.
But I see our role changing from like heads down programmer to more like analysts or trying to analyze what's the best tool, and we need to be diversified in what we can employ to get the job done.
Okay, we take one more question and then
Take
yes,
one more?
yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Recently there's a drug supply chain security act that supposedly is supposed to be effective this year in the U.S. I was just wondering if any of you are looking at some of the AI and data technologies to support it.
So I can't speak to supply chain. That's not the role in biostatistics. It's more around the clinical trial reporting and analysis. So apologies for that. I don't know if anyone. Or who we can steer
yeah,
this
I
to.
don't think.
That's not our
I mean,
role,
I'm curious now that you brought it up. I'll be taking a look at that. Yes, that's.
Apologies.
I'm a supply chain guy.
I know. No, that's great. We should definitely talk after.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we are at time, so thank you to the audience for joining us today, and also to my panelists here. Thank you guys so much for coming to Rev and taking part in this, and this has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.